There we go. Now it's recording. I'm so used to my Zoom account that I have it set for automatic record that I knew I'd forget that if someone didn't remind me. Let me think. Yes, there's going to be, like all the sessions today and tomorrow, we're going to try to remember to take a group photo at the end. We will alert you before we take a group photo. So you'll have the chance to either, you know, if you're okay with it being a live picture of you, great. If you want to, you know, shut off your video or escape, that's perfectly allowed too. And finally, I just want to remind you to take care of yourselves. We're going to try to build in a break. It's going to be a real quick break because we want to give you as much time to chat. But if you need to stretch, if you need to, you know, stand up while you're chatting, I've been known to shut off my video. I won't do it today. I've been known to shut off my video and wander around my office during Zoom conferences. So, all right. So now I'm going to ask you all. I'm going to ask you to write something out. All right. So now we'll be able to put this. Answer the question that was the very first question posed, which is, what do we mean by rural? Okay, so we want your answers on this. Can you go in the chat and start posting, what do you mean by rural?
Where should I write? Sorry.
What do you mean by rural? When we talk about rural communities, what do you mean by rural? We got some answers like
where?
Not the city. In the chat box, do you know where the chat box is? Okay. Not the city, more difficult to access services, living in a small town, an area that would define itself as rural. Somebody said whatever Allison said was good. It could be a larger town, but the group should define itself outside of urban, suburban. Geographic community, rich in possibilities, low in people, less than 5,000. A place that holds the more natural life living standards. Rural is any urban area close enough to agricultural production, so small in suburbs. Pretty diverse, country, hamlet, village, town, tight-knit community, populations of 25,000 or less. So lots of different ideas that are being added into our chat about what rural is. And I should mention that the reason that the four of us have been got together to be your hosting team is that we are all part of a ABCD Institute work group that is really interested in rural communities. And believe it or not, it wasn't until we started working on this that it occurred to me that none of us had sat down and like talked about what our definition of rural is. So for the sake of this meeting, we're pretty much going to go with how all of you define rural. All right. Most people, you know, the idea is that, you know, we think people can self-define themselves as rural. It's one of those things that's like, you know it when you see it. And yeah, you know, there's even a definition from the U.S. Census, but they define it as anything not urban. So I think that's pretty funny because, and you know, my husband used to work giving out grants to rural school districts, and they had very strict definitions about what rural school districts are. So funders might have one definition, but people that live in rural communities tend to have their own definition about whether or not they feel like they live in a rural community. So for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to talk about you know, pretty much how do people who live in those communities define them? You know, how do we ourselves define that? You know, I think no one would argue with me when I say I live in a rural community. We have 700 people in our community, and we're a half an hour from any other community. And, you know, most people would say, yeah, that's pretty rural. But then we have people who talk about, you know, populations of 25,000, and other people would say that's a small city, or that's bigger, you know, that's not rural. So I bring this all up because I just want to point out that we don't want to argue about what the definition of rural is. Since all of you responded in some way that you had either lived in or you work with rural communities, you know enough about the communities that you work with. All right, and today we're going, you know, we called our session "We Are It" because from personal experience, you know, this is actually a standing joke with my spouse and I. We joke that, you know, we live in a rural community, and if you want something done, we are it. We got to figure it out, you know. So as a number of people said in the chat, you know, rural communities can be seen as a place where there are very few services, or it's difficult to access services, or we can see it as, you know, places that are really rich in possibilities, rich in relationships. So our questions today for you all to talk in your groups will help you focus on those things. Before we jump into our groups, we're going to talk a little bit about some questions to consider no matter what the community is you're working with. These are 3 questions that were posed by John McKnight and Peter Block in their book called The Abundant Community. And Michael's going to talk us through those, and I'm going to try to put them up on the screen for y'all. So
well, thank you, Deb. Dee was the first face I saw this morning besides my wife and my dog. So it's good to see her at the end of my day as well. Hi, Dee. When I first joined the ABCD Institute faculty, I was a program director at a large community foundation. And I remember sitting with John McKnight, and John talking to me about how I approach questions of communities using their own assets, and every foundation, I think Jeff can speak to this as well, as can anybody who worked in the foundation world. Every foundation sort of balances this question about what is it that they need to do to be supportive of the folks who are coming to them and asking for support. And John asked these 3 questions very, very specifically, which was, what is it that communities can do for themselves? Because doing for yourself empowers yourself. What can communities do with a little help? And that's very often where foundations can and perhaps should intervene. What do you need? And the third is, what do you need someone else or some outside institution to do for them? So I'm going to use an example that originates with Tom Mossbacher, another ABCD Institute faculty person, that I think Deb said when we were talking about this session, she had stolen from him, and I think Jeff has done this as well. Imagine, those of you who live in the north and there is snow, that the first question is, you're out there shoveling for yourself. You're shoveling your own walk, your own steps. The second is, do you borrow a snowblower from a neighbor? Getting a little bit of help to do it, or maybe one of your neighbors comes down and helps you actually shovel your walk. And the third is the town or subdivision or your neighbors have a plow that they can use to plow the street itself. And I was thinking about this morning. I remember in the massive snowfall in Baltimore in 2016, where I was living at the time, there were no snow plows. We had to get the streets open, and all my neighbors came out together and we shoveled out the snow in those streets so we could get out. And that was a good set of answers to ABCD. Now, some of you live in southern environments where you don't see snow. I'm looking at you, Dee, and you may have other answers to this question. So I'll turn it back over to Deb. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Michael. So those are just 3 questions. And one of the things that John and Peter say in their book is that you really want to think about those questions in that order. You don't want to start with what does our community need from somebody outside, what do we need from somebody outside our community? Often that translates into paid services. And as we think about rural communities, it's often tough to get those paid services in some of our rural communities. But so you really want to start with that first question, which is what can people and communities do for themselves? I always like to tell people, if you have kids, these are 3 great questions to use for parenting. What can my kid do for themselves? What do they need a little help with? And what do they need me as their parent to do for them? And I just have always thought that that's great. So that we just wanted to present as kind of foundational information. The rest of our time together is going to be you all talking about some questions we're going to share with you. We're going to start out by, let me just give you a few sort of rules of the road here. I'm going to share my screen again. Okay, go to the next one. I think of this as sort of a modified world cafe. If we were in a real world cafe, we would have people shifting around in groups. We've decided that for the sake of connecting with each other, that sometimes it's better to spend time with the same group and get to know each other a little bit better. So we'll see how that goes. So it's sort of a modified world cafe, if you will, where we're going to pose some questions and give you guys some chances to talk with each other. We have a fair number of people, here with us today. So we're going to also ask that each group designates a recorder and a reporter. So the recorder is somebody who could just take some notes and share them with us, the host team. You can, I'll eventually put my email address in the chat box, and then you can email them to me, or I think you might even be able to attach a document in the chat. I'm not real sure about that. It seems like everybody's Zoom account is a little different some days. Anyway, so we're going to ask you to take to record some notes and share them with us. Then the reporter for your group will either share them verbally or in the chat. We won't have everybody share them out loud unless we find we have enough time to do that. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the rules of the road here. So I'll come back here, and I'm going to put our first question in the chat. Let me just copy that really quick. Oops. Make sure it goes to everybody too. All right, so our first question, when you get into your group, and you should be able to see the chat when you're in your group, our first question is, share a story about a rural community using an asset-based approach, even if that's not what they called it. We all know that most people in real life don't go around talking about asset-based community development unless they're like, people who are into ABCD. But we also see these stories happening all the time. So we're going to ask you in your groups to share, first introduce yourselves to each other, and then we're going to ask that you share a story with each other. Listen for the common themes or the big ideas that bump out at you. All right? And if you have questions, you can always type them in the chat. We'll be watching the chat. I'm going to put you all in breakout rooms now, and this is going to be randomly assigned. Let's see, I want to do, hold on a minute.
And Deb, how long will we be in the first small group?
Thank you very much for asking that. We're going to go until, let me look at the time. Well, I'm on the 6 o'clock hour, so 45 minutes past the hour. 6:45 here, or 45 past whatever hour you're on. And it'll give you a warning when it's, I think, a minute left or 2 minutes left, something like that. Okay? Thanks, everybody. Here you go. I'm not sure. Amy, are you there? You look like you're not in your group. Oh, there she goes. And Fiona is drawing pictures. Fiona, you are a love, let me tell you. There's John.
Hey,
Hi,
Deb.
John. I gotta set my timer to give them a heads up. It's gonna be in 15 minutes, so I'll give them a 2 minutes of 13. There we go. Oops. All right. Oh, Emily. Emily seems to be by herself. I'm going to move her. Let me just tell her that. Maybe I can't tell her that. Okay. I should have joined her.
Yeah, if someone joins us after you have breakout rooms, they miss out.
Yeah, I'm just gonna tell her that. Sorry, I apologize, these guys. Or check with these guys. Okay, people are going to be coming back any second now. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. All right. We still have a few folks coming back in. All right. So at least one person had fun doing that. Michael Marcus says that was fun. So for our harvest for this question, I'm wondering about like, what are the big themes or the big ideas, or what are the common elements between the stories that you heard about? With somebody from, let's see, breakout room number 1, it was Hannah and John, Hammerlink and Kristen. Somebody from that group want to volunteer to share with our group?
I'm happy to share. We got very caught up in our introductions, so we didn't get to everybody's story. But I think what was coming out of the conversation, at least what I was hearing, was this opportunity to provide spaces in rural communities, whether that's within the population itself or in partnership with urban communities and institutions, but creating a space to foster communities identifying their own challenges. And then from there, they will know their own solutions. So if that space is fostered and that space is created, then there's an opportunity to work through, okay, what's the specific challenge? How can we map out our assets? How can we map out our resources? And then from there, work through how we can create a solution to the issue within the context that we're working.
Okay. So are you talking about an actual physical space, or like places and times where people can gather together and talk about those things?
I think both. So it came out in the stories that we were sharing as sort of foundations that were focusing on specific issues in which communities could engage in directly with the organization and identify their own challenge. And then I think also in creating sort of an opportunity for dialogue, whether that's physical or not.
Okay. Okay, great. I also want to mention to everyone, while people are contributing, you know, what their groups talked about, feel free to add to the chat. You know, if there's things that popped out at you, either from the person who's reporting out, or just something that you thought was you wanted to make sure gets noted somewhere. Okay. All right. Thanks, Hannah. Is it Hannah or Hannah?
It's Hannah. You got it right.
All right.
Thanks, Deb.
Thanks, Hannah. All right. And then we've got Barbara and Fiona and Michael, Marcus, and Nathan Cross in group 2. Who wants to?
I think I was chosen to be the one to talk. I am new at ABCD, so I wanted to hear their stories. This is all a learning experience for me. And, but sure enough, their stories connect with the things I do in my work with community development. And I think the connecting principle with all their stories was, I mean, it sounds like exactly what ABCD is, but they all talked about the assets and, you know, kind of mapping out what assets they had in the communities and how those could be used to tackle the issues sometimes that they had. And they all 3 had awesome stories to tell. And it sounds like it worked out really, really well. If you want to hear a really interesting one, I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name, from New Zealand, but he talked about
Nathan.
A group that from growing cannabis to growing legal vegetables. So it's a good story. They all were, but that was kind of fun.
All right. Thanks so much, Barbara. Thank you. All right, we have time for one more group to share out. I'll just open it up to the other groups that I haven't called on. If one of the other groups wants to share out, we're going to have 2 more rounds, so everybody will have a chance to share something.
I'll go. First of all, I want to say that in Canada, cannabis is a legal thing. So I'd love to hear the other. But no, I think it was really interesting because we had very diverse stories, but they almost all seemed to start with a group coming together and complaining about all the things that were wrong in their small town and all the things they didn't have access to. And by helping to start to shift, like asking different questions and asking people to start to connect with one another, this idea around, oh, we do have assets really started to emerge. And as soon as it was almost like they would hit a tipping point, and then the possibilities exploded, and like they created new connections, and suddenly they walked away feeling like they did have power and they could make change. So that was the big theme. I said it much more eloquently before, but essentially it. I don't know if anybody else from my group wants to add to that.
Anybody else want to comment on that one from Glenda's group? So it was like they had to hit this tipping point, it sounds like. Is that right? And it was all about how are you asking the questions? How are you thinking about your community?
Yeah, and some people just hadn't thought about all that. Like somebody said that, you know, one community had never thought about their assets. And so it started with saying, well, we have sidewalks. And then they were able to dig deep from there. But that's how basic some of the conversation started.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Glenda. Jeff also shared that some of the themes in group C were like participation, sense of community ownership, responsibility, identifying local assets, feeling this is our place. You know, that takes me back to the name of our session, which is We Are It, right? I get that feeling a lot from the community that I work in. So we're gonna go into our next round here, and we're gonna have and it's building on these stories and what you were listening to each other. And you know, you could talk about this in whatever way works for you, whether it's talking about more stories or coming up with examples or just sort of thinking about the differences. But we're trying to capture if you've lived in a rural community, I would hazard a guess that you would at some point say what I say sometimes, which is, boy, this is really different from when we lived in the city. And so, you know, not that, you know, there's a lot of shared experiences, there's a lot of, you know, similarities, especially when we think about assets. But what do you think we can learn from rural communities? How are rural communities different from urban or even suburban communities? You know, what are the lessons that we could learn from that, from our experiences living working with rural communities? All right, I'm going to open the rooms, and you have 15 minutes for this one. So let me just see what the time will be. It's 7:10, well, 10 after the hour. And I'll do the same thing. I'll give you a 2-minute warning again. You all got that last time, right? I hope so. All right. All right, I set my timer. Hi, John. Can you hear me, John? I don't know if you have your mic connected or I don't hear you. Everyone's out in groups right now, but they're coming back in like 2 minutes. So I can't hear you. Can you hear me? You're not on mute on my end. It shows that you are not muted. So I'm not sure. All right, so I'm going to close the breakout rooms and everyone's going to come back and join us. So hopefully you'll be able to figure out what's going on with your sound over there. Now you look like you're frozen. Oh no, you're back. But everyone will be joining us in 60 seconds. Or less. Welcome back. Waiting for folks to finish up their groups and come on back.
I'm surprised we came back so quickly. We're having a lively conversation.
Well, that's good. Glad to hear that. Everyone's coming back now. And I think we have everyone back. We've also been joined by John McKnight, except we're not sure if we can hear him. Say hi, John. Can we hear you? I'm not sure if he can hear us. I think he's still trying to figure this out. So, all right.
I know who he is.
So
I was researching this. There, hi, John.
everyone's noticing that John's here. Hi, John. Everybody say hi, John.
Hi, John.
Hi,
Hey,
John.
John.
He's trying to figure out if he
Hi,
can get
John.
connected up there. So we're gonna jump back into the harvest here. I hope you all had a chance to stand up. Did you see my message reminding you to stand up and stretch? I hope you all had to stand up. And if you didn't, you can shut off your video and still keep listening. You know, I stand up all the time, but then you see my fine belly. So be sure and, you know, take care of yourselves, as we mentioned at the beginning of the call. So let's talk about what you heard on this this time around. We asked you to think about what can we learn from rural communities? How are they different from urban, you know, or suburban communities? I guess another way of saying this, what are the unique assets of rural communities? or the unique ways of operating in rural communities. Let's see, last time we heard from, I think rooms 1 and 2, we can go down to room 3. We had Allison, Amy, Jeff Yost, and Monica in that group. If somebody in that group would like to share, and remember, anybody is welcome at any time to write in the chat, okay? So feel free. All right, who said yes? I heard somebody say yes. Allison, you did.
So we talked about resiliency and being resilient as a thing that you often see in rural communities, as well as being relational, but also talking about that in the sense of both being different and being something to be learned from, but also tension being there. So you know people, you have relationships with people, but some of those structures, people are in the same position for years after years, and that can create tension too.
And tell us a little bit more about the resiliency aspect. I mean, can you have an example or a story?
I think Monica or Amy were talking about just the nobody's coming. We is it. Nobody's coming to take care of things. We recognize that that we need to mobilize ourselves and our own assets to address issues.
Gotcha. All right. Anybody else from that group want to comment on anything else and said?
This is Monica. Well, I think to the idea that when you live in a rural setting and you're farming, the time frame of success is much different than when you are in an urban setting where everything is like one paycheck to another, right? So I think the resilience comes in by knowing that you have to walk the path for many seasons before you actually see the harvest of it. So.
And especially if we're talking about people who farm, you know, they're much more at the, you know, they have to be much more in tune to what nature is doing, because it has such a direct impact on their livelihoods, right? I think living in the city, we tend to think of weather as a convenience or an inconvenience, whereas in a rural area of, you know, with a lot of farmers, there's much more of that direct impact. I was also interested in what you were saying about the relationship, you know, aspect of it. You know, people know each other, people know about each other, and there's good and there's not so good about that sometimes, right? Sometimes you can get sort of stuck in what your family has always been involved with, for example, or how people have always, you know, they know everything about you. I told the story earlier today on another call, but I just want to share this one really quickly. When we had this house on this island for about 15 years, but just moved up here full time 2 years ago. And when we were selling our house in the city 2 years ago, we had people come for an open house to, you know, look at the house and see if they were, you know, might want to buy it. And a lot of people were asking us where we were going to move. And we told them we were going to move to Door County. Well, one young couple, turns out their names were Hannah and Steve, asked us where in Door County. And when we told them Washington Island, they started laughing because it turned out that Hannah had taught on the island for 2 years and in fact was part of the Nierenhausen family on the island, which there's lots of people related to her here on the island. So sure enough, we had this pressure that we had to make sure we wound up selling our house to them, and we always kept our fingers crossed that nothing broke or looked awful or whatever, because we knew everybody on the island would know about this, right? And then not only that, but once we were here, people would actually walk up to us and say, "Are you those people from Madison who sold their house to Hannah? I'm her aunt," or "I'm her uncle." You know, so all of a sudden, you know, we were the people that sold our house to Hannah, and that was our label, if you will. So for good or bad, people know about you. So I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. All right, how about group 4, we have Julie and Mebel and Renee and is it Rochelle? Who would like to share from that group? I think Renee had actually put a really wonderful comment as well in our chat. Could it be that a strength of living rural is each person is important and that it's harder to be an invisible community member? So when hardships and needs arise, all are touched personally, neighbors, friends, etc. They find answers together, since in rural, solutions are not at the city limits waiting to rush in. So, but I'd like to hear from that group. Who in that group would like to report out or tell us what you talked about?
Okay. I'll do it. So,
Thanks,
I mean, I think we talked about a lot of similar things to what group 3 talked about. A couple of things that came up in our group that maybe were a little different, or there was the idea that in a rural community, and Mabel in particular was talking about this in a very rural community in Kenya. Her sense was that in a rural place, the kind of natural knowledge that sort of, passes from person to person verbally or from generation to generation is quite strong, and maybe not as much reliance on knowledge that's just coming from the sort of experts or the institutions. So just the knowledge base is maybe just different and strong and is passed along. And Rochelle also said she felt that, in a rural community, you know who the experts are. Like whatever you need, you will know who the person is to go to for that thing. And that is something that's kind of special about rural communities. But yeah, we talked so much about relationships and people really knowing one another, and being very hard to be invisible also.
I know my husband and I joke quite often that like on Saturday I stopped by we have a tiny little farmer's market with like 3 stands, and somebody came walking past me wearing her mask. I was wearing my mask. She said, "Hi Deb, how are you?" I said, "Great." She walked by me. I had no idea who that person was because I'm still the newbie in the community, even though I've been here 2 years. But they all know me, and they know my husband and our daughter, who has worked on the island as well too. So that relationship piece and everybody knowing you. Also, that thing about the experts, we find that all the time. Just today, we had somebody working on some painting on the outside of our house, and we need some trees taken down. I said, "Do you know anybody who can take down trees?" He gave me 5 names, like on the spot. These are the people, and this one's the cheapest, he says. So, all right, how about group 5? Group 5 is Dee, Emily, 2 Emilys, and Glenda.
Yeah, so it's interesting some of the commonalities that are coming out, and that one that in community or in rural communities, there seems to be a greater sense of safety and belonging, because everyone is needed, and you need to show up for each other. People tend to show up. You don't have to, but when you see someone who needs help, you just help however you can, rather than in urban context, which you kind of tend to fade to the background, and somebody else, a professional, will come help. But you're it. We talked about how people in rural communities are often resourceful in different ways. And that's kind of what Julie was just talking about, or Deb, you were just talking about too, about, you got 5 names right away because everybody. Yeah. And innovation, people have to get really innovative, and the quote comes up, it doesn't come this far up the valley. And then Dee followed that up with her own quote saying, "Yeah, so that's why they make shit up." Quote. And so that resource, that innovation, and just their ability to think outside the box without always knowing that they're looking outside the box. And I think I'll leave it, but there's more, and I'll send them all to you, but those are some of the highlights.
You know, the things that you guys are sharing are just triggering stories for me as well. You know, this idea about, you know, we have to figure it out. We're it. I think that, you know, with the pandemic happening and everybody getting on lockdown, I mean, I've seen that even more, if you will. I'm sure that's true in all communities. But I've seen examples of that in our rural community. You know, at a school board meeting, right when the schools got closed, one of the residents of our community who had just built these lovely little cottages to rent out, which weren't going to be rented, we knew all the kids were going to have to be on the internet, and there's spotty places for the internet. And he offered to let families use his cottages just for classes. So if you had a kid and you didn't have internet, you could go and sign up to use his cottage for free. You know, so we see people stepping up like that, and, you know, knowing each other and trying to figure that out. John, I just have to tell you, I don't know if you can hear me, but we see that you keep trying to get in, and we keep trying to let you in, and I don't know what's going on with getting you in here. So you may need to hang up and come back if you can hear me. So, all right. Let's see. That was the last group. So we have one more question for you all. All right. We have one more question for you all. This last question gets at what do you bring to the table? Now, you all told us that you live in rural areas, you grew up in rural areas, you work in rural areas, you work with rural areas, you have family members in rural areas. You all are connected to rural areas. So what do you bring to the table? The question that we're going to give you is this one. What experience, skills, knowledge do you have working with rural communities that others might find helpful? What are the gifts that you can bring to rural communities, and how might you share that? So, you know, you could think about this question in terms of an actual rural community that you're working with, or you could think about this question in terms of how can you share what you know about rural communities with people who may not know about rural communities or who are trying to learn about rural communities. So you could take it any direction that you want to. All right, everybody good with that? I'm going to give you I'll give you about 15 minutes. So it'll be about 42 after, I guess. All right, so go, open rooms. All right. John, I don't know what's happening with you, John. I don't know if I have a phone number for you, John. Let's see. Tell Kim. Hey, John.
Just a moment.
John's still trying to figure it out, but we figured out that AOL does not work and play well with Zoom. So, but everybody's coming back.
Deb, I have to go to our session is about to start. So it's just Fiona.
Oh.
So I need to duck off.
Can I take a picture quick? Can I take a picture quick before you leave? Do you have enough time to stick around for just a quick screenshot?
I will go, but what I'll do is I'll send you a picture of the part of the harvest with yours in it as well.
That'd be great.
Okay.
That'd be wonderful.
Thank you,
Fiona.
Great session. I'm going to re-listen to it.
Oh, good. Oh, good.
Thanks.
Okay, everybody is coming back. Before we do anything else, I want to make sure that I get a screenshot. So put on your biggest, brightest smiles, turn on your cameras or turn off your cameras as the case may be, but we'd love to see your beautiful smiles. We still have John trying to figure out how to be on here. 1, 2, 3, snap. I'm going to do one more just to make sure. 1, 2, 3, snap. Great. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so let's do this. For this one, what I'd like you to do for the harvest for this, I'd like you to start putting in the chat what kinds of ideas you have for ways that you could share your gifts, your skills, your knowledge around rural communities, either with your rural community or with other people about rural communities, and why people are writing that in there. Feel free to talk about it as well. Who would like to talk out loud?
Well, this is Jeff Yost. I'm happy to report out from our group if that would be a good way to start. So Allison brought up the importance of invitation. And I think that is so essential in all of this work, which is lots of times people will assume that they think other people know they're welcome, or they know that they're, you know, a part of the group. But for lots of people, that's not obvious to them. So the importance of invitation, I think, is just incredibly important. Amy brought up, I think, 3 really beautiful things. She talked about serving as a mirror to reflect perspective, serving as a spotlight to help people really see and embrace the assets in their place, and ask questions that if you're someone coming in from outside, it may be easier for you to be able to ask those questions as opposed to somebody locally asking questions. And then I just brought up a couple quick things. One is the importance of stories. So trying not to be theoretical about it, but really trying to be practical and pragmatic about, here's the stories of how a community succeeded. Here are the stories of how a community or a group of individuals struggled and what they learned. And then finally, the idea of challenging assumptions of local capacity, because we know that there's more capacity in every place than is obvious to any one person. So I'd kick it off with a few of those thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you. I see John Hammerling has added a few comments as well. Muster up the courage to introduce yourself to strangers, especially perceived to be at the margins of the community. That is absolutely true. You know, I mean, we talked about how people know a lot about you in rural communities, but just because people know about you doesn't mean that they have relationships with you. So we still, even in rural communities, have people who are at the margins. So that's, and introducing ourselves, you know, I've learned that firsthand, having to introduce myself to people I don't know. Although in our community, if you're at the store, if you're at the coffee shop, wherever you're at, people just walk up to you, especially in the winter when there's no tourists around. They'll walk up to you and say, now who are you and whose house did you buy? So it's all about where, you know, again, that sense of place. So, but I agree that, you know, that taking that risk to step out and introduction is the first thing. And I love that idea of invitation too, Jeff, because I think it kind of goes both ways, if you will. It goes in terms of like, if I am going to work, if I have a desire to work with a community, I don't want to just barge into that community. I want to feel like I'm invited into that community. And then we have to extend the invitation when we are in a community. We have to extend that invitation to people, you know, again, as John mentioned, you know, the people that are at the margins or at the edges. How do we extend invitations in a way so everyone feels welcome to share their gifts and talents and contribute to their community? How about another person or another group talking about, well, how you feel like you could share your gifts and talents, or you know, how you might where this question took your conversation?
I could speak. I'm group 4.
Thanks, Renee.
Gosh, I hope I get this right. So we were really, we shared what we felt like we had that we could bring to the table, basically, to assist rural communities and our strengths. And so one of our members has the good training of ABCD community development, which I'm still learning about and eager to learn about, and bringing that to a community, having that format in which to learn to work together and solve problems and challenges and hopes and dreams as well, I think is very valuable to bring to the table. We also, one of the things mentioned was working with the strength of the people that they're working with, recognizing those strengths, seeing it, and then working with that. I thought, yes, I have a good group. Then we have optimism is another very strong one that they can take to the table, is seeing things from an optimistic point of view rather than being pulled into the downside of things, seeing the upside of things and the hope, and bringing that to the table, I think, is a great gift. And then, you know, being passionate about that community's who they are, where they are now, and where they want to go. Be passionate about it. It's the one I said because what I tell people all the time is that it's like a Bic lighter. You got that little thing at the top, you flip, you know, and it makes the spark, and the fuel inside makes the flame. And the best I can do is come to town and be a spark, and the community needs to provide that fuel to make things happen. And so, you know, actually, I think our group would be a fantastic team. Yes, to work together in community.
All right.
Thanks.
Next time we'll ask you to make a cheer for your group or something. All right. Thank you so much, Renee. All right. How about somebody else? We've got a few more minutes here that we can have a couple more folks report out. Who else would like to share what they talked about in their group, or thoughts about what you yourself, you know, have been really thinking about throughout this whole session of talking about rural communities?
I want to say that I learned a number of things from the people in our group. One is Nathan can put it in his own terms if he wants, but I think, Nathan, you were talking about being approachable and being open to people, you know, not bringing your own judgment and letting people know that. And I thought that was really important that you put out there. And the other was to understand that I think that people are thinking about sort of creating something as opposed to just thinking about what they can get individually. And I thought those were creating something from what everybody in the community can bring to it. And I thought those were really important lessons. You used different language for both of those, but I thought it was great.
You know, those are great ideas, and those just trigger some things that Steve and I talked about when we first moved here to our community. We decided we were going to start by showing up at like everything, just showing up, and that we would smile at people and that we would pretty much say yes to lots of, you know, if there were like invitations to go to things or people want, you know, told us about something. Although the good advice we got was to say no to joining any boards or committees for a year, because when you move into a community like this, as we were told, we were fresh meat. So they needed more people to help with stuff. And they weren't afraid to like drag you in and say, you need to help with something. But you know, just showing up at stuff, going to things, especially, you know, here, this community has many tourists that come in the summertime, but in the winter, it really is just us. And so we started going to things just to show up. And it was a wonderful way to meet people that we would not have crossed paths with otherwise. And I think in a way, that's why this pandemic has been hard, because those avenues for just naturally those third places in our community have been closed. Those gatherings have not been taking place that have been open to the whole community. So that's been more challenging for us as well. So I love that, you know, being approachable. I think that's a great suggestion. All right, one last comment from somebody. Anybody who else would like to say anything about what we've talked about, either in your last session or throughout this evening or morning for some people?
I'll actually nominate somebody to talk if they're willing to do it. So Amy talked about the fact that she did a graduate program with Cornelia Flora around the community capitals framework. And Amy talked about the importance of social and cultural capital, as long as if social and cultural capital are really present and alive, it makes it much, much easier to do other developmental programs. So, you know, the social, emotional, cultural capital elements being really prerequisites for community economic development and prosperity. Amy, do you want to speak to that for a minute?
Sure. Well, I think you summed it up, but a lot of times in Appalachia, I'm from Tennessee, you know, and I would say the Reverend also knows this, like a lot of our communities are really devastated. And it can just be, you know, even if they've had great successes in the past, like with the opioid epidemic and everything, it can just be super draining. And there's just a lot of lost hope. So I think that it's really key to talk about and remind people you don't have to have the money, and you don't have to have the buildings. You know, let's start with who we know. Let's start with you know, what's great about this place, because we are very proud people. And we really value our culture. And I think that's very true for a lot of rural places. So I think the studies that have really highlighted that built that cultural and social capital, so the things that make us who we are actually catalysts for creating some of these other capitals, is really important to carry to the communities that we interface with. I guess that's one of the most valuable things that I've learned within the community capitals framework, and I really encourage everybody to look into that when it comes to asset-based community development. I think that these are great interconnected ways of interacting with communities. But yes, I'm definitely new with this. My background's in community organizing, so I'm coming from a conflict theory to more asset-based, solution-oriented. So I'm still bringing that power analysis type stuff with me. So anyway, it's been a great adventure. Thank you for letting me speak.
Well, that's a perfect way to wind up our conversation. I want to say a couple things before people all sign off. I have put two things in the chat just now. One is my email address. Feel free to be in contact with me. We are also hoping to get all your contact information from the organizers. I think that that's available to us because you all had to do that to sign up. And we will be following up with an email to you all sometime within the next couple of weeks. Depends on people's schedules, but we're going to follow up with an email to you. And one of the things that we'll do is we'll let you know, I think the conference organizers are going to let you know about the recordings and all that kind of stuff. But we also are going to follow up with you because, as I mentioned at the beginning of our call together, I'm one of the co-founders of ABCD in Action. And I've set aside an area in the community forum to talk about rural stuff, and you can start conversations, you can ask questions, you can share resources. There is a work group through the ABCD Institute that is focusing on rural communities, and we have started a resource list, and we can link that into the discussion forum as well for rural communities. So we'll send you all that information out, like I said, in a couple of weeks. But if you want to just make note of that address for ABCD in Action, a quick note about that: we have about 2,400 members from over 75 countries, and it's open to anybody from like John McKnight all the way to the person who just Googled community development and stumbled upon us. And everybody in between. There's no charge for joining. We protect your email. We don't share it with anybody except to send out things from the Institute or from the ABCD in Action. So it's a great opportunity for you to connect with other people, to learn from each other, to post questions. So it's a lot of fun. So anybody want to say, how about a quick run around the circle, and I'll just call your name and you just say one word or one thought really quick. And we'll start with Emily Kennedy.
Oh, this was awesome. I don't know if that answered your question. Sorry.
That's great. Nope, just one word or one thought. Is it Monica?
Encouraging.
Encouraging. Great. Emily Solzy? Oh,
pretty close.
Solzy.
Solzy.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you.
Energizing.
Great. Barbara.
I was going to say energizing. Awesome.
You could be energized. Renee.
I'm limited to one word.
You put a couple.
I really have, I'm struggling. I would say it is empowering. You give me strength.
Great. Great. Glenda.
I'm going with energizing also.
Right. Amy.
Inspiring and motivating.
Julie.
I'm feeling grateful to all of you.
John. John McKnight, I don't know if you can talk yet, so you can just wave. John Unger.
Enthusiastical.
Okay. Kristen.
Eager to learn more.
Rochelle.
Refueled.
Great. Jeff.
Together.
John Hamerlink.
I'm excited to see so many people who are younger than I am involved in this work.
Mm-hmm. Michael Marcus.
Encouraging.
Mm-hmm. And Nathan.
A fresh perspective.
Great. And I guess the word for me is connected. It was really wonderful to connect with all of you. And I hope that we can continue to stay connected to talk more about rural communities. So look forward to hearing from us in a couple of weeks. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.